I'm going to try and tell you a little bit of a story and also provoke you to think a little bit. So it's going to go quite quickly, but the object here is I will show you some science facts that comes from the IPCC, but a lot of the opinion that you hear comes from me. So I first came to Kathmandu 53 years ago. That seems like a very long time. I was somewhat younger than all of you. It was a very different town at that time. It was a quiet, small, beautiful town with a lot of poor people. But at that time, if you look forward, and this qualifies for an assessment, it's assessment in the medium term, 50 years, one would not have imagined a few things. Kathmandu at that time was maybe 1 lakh people. It's grown 10 times now. It's over 1 million people. It's changed dramatically, and I've been coming back over the years and I've seen many, many parts of that thing. One would have not imagined that Nepal would have gone through the kind of crisis it went through from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, which of course is part of the story that I'm going to tell you just now. And at that time, we had no idea, at least I had no idea, that I'd be standing in front of you and we'd be talking about climate change. Nobody had any clue about this, that this was something that was critical. All the precursors were there. A lot of the processes that we see today had started at that point of time. Certainly not in this country, but in other parts of the world. So in some senses, what can happen locally, or what happens locally can be dramatically changed by things that happen in other parts of the world. And I think that's the interesting tension that we have when we look at the choices before us, especially from developing countries, and try and understand, what's actually happening here. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about development pathways and how they relate to climate change. Because the core challenge that all of us, at least in this room, face is how do you try and understand the process of development. So I guess the core sort of research question I'm trying to answer here is, why is scaling the implementation of these so-called sustainable development and climate actions important? I mean, we hear a lot about them. There's a tremendous amount of science. We spend a lot of our time and effort doing them. But why is it important in our context today, especially in a country like Nepal, especially in a city like this? Sustainable development, in some senses, gives us the opportunity to balance things which are seen as opposites. So, the present, what we need to do just now, and the future. We are looking with science and a whole range of things at what may happen in the future. We've seen the scenarios, we've seen a lot of that stuff that's there. Also, how to deal with the opportunities that many of us are seeking, along with the deeply embedded challenges that we live with in everyday life. So how do you hold that together? And especially in Nepal, and this is true of many countries in South Asia, how to keep the balance between the rural and the urban, because that's very, very critical. Kathmandu is a very small proportion of the overall population of Nepal. It concentrates a lot of its resources. It has a lot of risk that comes here, but keeping that balance is quite important, and we often tend to forget that. So one of the questions is, can countries and regions, this is important because in a country like Nepal, like the country I come from, there's a lot of regional variation. So you can't talk about an average. An average actually has no sense. You have to talk about the extremes and see what's happening. So the question is, can countries and regions become more sustainable? This is a framework, Hans showed it, which is, sort of set up by the United Nations. Your prime minister, your government actually went out and supported it when we were negotiating this in 2013, 14, and 15. It is a universal agenda. This is a really remarkable thing that's happened. It may not be possible to make this happen again. It's a universal agenda where there's a commitment to say that everybody, no country and no place would have poverty, where everybody would have food, universal healthcare, etc., etc. So the things that we conventionally take as part of development. But there are 2 or 3 really important differences. The environment agenda, which started in '92 with Rio and a whole range of other processes, is integral to this process just now. So you see a commitment to dealing with life below water, above land. Of course, Nepal is a landlocked state, so you don't have water in some senses in the way that it will look at otherwise. And critically, climate change is part of that process. But inside this idea, that everybody everywhere would actually connect this, are 3 very interesting, I would say, revolutionary thoughts here. The first thought is that no one should be left behind. It's not only about the averages, which means that we start with the most vulnerable. And this is absolutely critical to the idea of adaptation, because adaptation, at least in our environments, is critically related to vulnerability. The second thing is that no place would be left behind. And in a country which has so much of diversity, and you can see that in all the risks that you see, and we've seen that just now in what Aditi showed us, the idea of dealing with spatial justice is very important. And finally, you cannot do no one or no place behind unless we make sure that no ecosystem is left behind. And that is, I guess, the whole message and experience of the assessment they've done here, which is, I think, very, very important. So it's a really interesting idea, a universal set of goals in which no one, no place, and no ecosystem is left behind. How are we doing in that context? I'm going to show you very quickly the analytics. This comes out of work that was published just a week ago at the High-Level Political Forum. I also co-chair UNSTSN. This is the picture for Nepal. So let's take a minute and look at it. Okay? So on the left-hand side there is a set of all of these goals. You know, there's 17 of them. Somebody will know them. I can read them off otherwise. That's a polar diagram that starts with number 1, that is end of poverty at the top, and goes all the way around to number 17, which is dealing with partnerships at the end. And so essentially what you can see is, you can see all of development in one particular framework. That's on, that round thing that's there on the left-hand side. And then there are two bars that are there, which basically give you, red means you're in trouble. So effectively, Nepal is not doing so badly in terms of poverty. It's still a country which has a lot of poverty, but there's serious issues of goal number 2 around questions of hunger and nutrition. Interestingly, if you look at goal number 13, around climate, you're doing better than many other places. Why is that so? Because when I first came here, I guess our sort of back projections show that Nepal is probably producing less than 0.01 tons per capita. You're currently at 0.2 going to 0.3. Nowhere near where the rest of the world is. In fact, you're well below the threshold. So the question of CBDR is a very critical question here. So that at the top there is a dashboard that shows us how well we're doing in the goals across the world and in each country. And below that are a set of arrows which show us if we have to meet this in 2030, where you're actually sitting. And actually, one of the good things I would say post-2006 in Nepal is you're making progress on a whole range of counts. So most of the arrows are moving upwards, excepting, of course, cities. We know that. That's a challenge of Kathmandu in some senses. So this is a framework that allows us to be able to compare where we are today across these multiple dimensions, including climate, the snapshot, and where we need to go to. So that's interesting, yeah? But to do that, you have to really look at the comparisons. So I'm going to show you a country that's really near the top. That's Sweden there. And there are 4 other numbers that you see on the slide. On the bottom right-hand corner is a population of Sweden. So, Sweden is, by European standards, a relatively big country, but it's 1/3 the size of Nepal. It's, of course, much, much smaller. I mean, the city that I live in has more people than the people in Sweden, fine? And then there are 2 other numbers. The top right-hand corner is a GDP per capita, fine? So if I go back, Nepal, 28 million people, 28 billion population, a GDP per capita of about 1,000. Sweden has a GDP per capita of 55,000. So you need to get the sense of scale. This is very important as we try and understand development. Also, something that's on the top right-hand counter, the HDI, the Human Development Index, our investment in people on education and health and questions of poverty. It gives you a sense of how we're actually moving. And then something that's very important in ecological terms, the biocapacity deficit. Sweden, of course, is a large country with relatively less people, low densities, so you have a positive biocapacity. So let me quickly run you through 5 different countries to get you a sense of what's happening. Sweden is number 2 on the Sustainable Development Index. That was released 10 days ago. Let me step down. That's the UK. So you can see the difference between Sweden and the UK on a whole range of counts. So there's more inequality in the UK. There are a whole range of other environmental challenges that the UK faces, which Sweden doesn't. So you can start understanding how the dynamics of development play itself out. And even if you look at the processes of the arrows at the moment, you can see that on many counts, on questions of, let's say, food security, the UK is not doing well compared to other countries. In fact, they have some data gaps in particular places. That's Japan, a country that's looked up very strongly in Asia. Japan sits at number 15 in that ranking. But you see on many, many dimensions, Japan is not doing very well. So sustainable development in some senses is being able to fill out that entire circle there. That's getting to where your goals are. Japan has many, many challenges. Why? It's an island nation. So obviously it'll have environmental challenges. It'll have issues around energy. Yeah? There are a whole range of constraints that our geographies, our histories, and our societies give us. Japan is doing well on many counts, but on some things it's not doing well at all. So if you actually look at questions of equality, there's an arrow pointing downwards. This is the dynamics of development. This is a sort of an articulation of what a development pathway would look like, especially in a country of 127 million people that's actually losing population in some senses, okay? That's the United States. People are often very surprised to find that the United States, the largest economy in the world, is number 35 in the rankings, right? Why is that? Look at the SDG polar diagram. A whole range of serious challenges. And this is a time series here. You can see exactly where the challenges are existing in the US. So if you look at the arrows, there are 3 green arrows, and then there are a whole range of arrows in which there's not much happening there. Fine? So even though you have a GDP per capita, number 8 in the world, of $62,000 per capita, a high HDI, a large population, you can have a whole range of serious development challenges. In fact, the most important thing that the SDGs give us is the idea, and this is a difficult idea for some people to swallow, that every country is a developing country. Right? So even the United States has huge challenges in spite of the fact that it has such a large economy in the world. That's China, one of the 2 neighbors that you're sort of sandwiched in the middle of. China has done remarkable things in the last 15 or 20 years on development, but China, as you well know, has very serious environmental challenges. I work on China, so we got a sense of it. And you can see there are a whole range of areas, including climate, that the Chinese SDGs are in the red. On other things, they've done remarkably well. Poverty, I guess, is one of the most remarkable things they've done, and also in terms of industrialization and productivity. So, and then there's yourself. Okay, so China is sitting at number 39 in the rankings, per capita GDP of almost $10,000, population of 1.4 billion. That's Nepal again, fine. Now the interesting thing, of course, is, would you have guessed that India has a lower ranking than Nepal has? So depending on size and scale, there are a whole range of issues that are compromising there. So the question that comes to us is, how could Nepal prioritize SDG implementation? And it's fairly obvious that you have to pick and choose processes within this. The rankings are there, the development pathway sort of looks at whatever we're dealing with. And I would say one of the interesting things are the obvious things. You've got to deal with health, education, the obvious sort of basic needs questions. You also have to deal with jobs, and you have to deal with questions of inequality, which is very severe in Nepal. But if you don't start at the bottom of that base, which is dealing with questions of climate, which is a huge risk, fine, and dealing with questions of ecosystem stability. Because of the nature of the economy, because of the nature of your society, there are going to be serious challenges. So what I'm saying is there are ways of thinking about these questions and how you can tie it together. How can we operationalize this? So I just give you an example from India. You have to take this down from the national level, and this is every Indian state, and you can see India's states are very different. So you've got to take it down into provinces, and then from there you have to take it down to districts, and if you can take it down further, it's even better. And that's the sense that it's actually quite good. But one interesting thing, and a caution that's there, and this is a space that, in a sense, hopefully Nepal can actually tunnel through. Fossil fuels in development have had a close but difficult relationship for the last 150 years. They've created the Industrial Revolution, fine. They've created cities that are full of cars and other wonderful things, and that's the pollution that you don't get to see because it's raining at the current point of time. And all of this is fueled by a limitless supply of fossil fuel. This is the assumption. As a country that has faced a whole range of challenges in terms of fuel supply, I've seen Kathmandu at times when you haven't had fuel supply from another country that's next to you for many months, and it's really, really horrible and very difficult. There are some unintended consequences of that process. This is an image from this morning, and this is in spite of the monsoon. This is global SO2 emissions. So you can actually have emissions at 0.2 tons per capita. And I've taken SO2 because it's easier to see, but that doesn't help you very much because your glaciers will still melt because of processes that are happening outside. And of course, now we have the science, we have the satellites that can track this, on a daily or in fact, almost on an hourly basis. So the basic idea is that we have to connect the local to the global. If we're not able to do that, we're in deep trouble, fine? And if we don't do that, we're especially those of us at the margins are in a very difficult place. But the thing that actually sort of is trying to deal with this question are the SDGs. That's the General Assembly where I helped negotiate the process that's there. That's the Paris Agreement, which has given us a framework that's there. And this is Hans and Deborah, and Thelma's not in this image, but she was on the floor of the House when we really created, I think, one of the most important science reports of 2018. And that's not me saying that, that's Nature and Science saying that. So Incheon gave us this great gift of science 1.5. But the story that we don't tell, and this is not the IPCC telling it, it's me telling you that, is that the NDCs, the stuff that we agreed in Paris, is actually the fast elevator to somewhere near 3 degrees. And this is, I think, it's a difficulty. When your negotiators go in and actually deal with the question in any of these processes, we've agreed that we're going to reach 3. So we actually have to dramatically change things. And I guess the 1.5 report is really the way in which we can actually, try and see whether we can make it possible. So the key thing that I think you have to understand is what we outlined in the 1.5 report, I was one of the CLAs in this, is the idea of overshoot. That is, it's very possible that in spite of everything that we do, especially because of people outside this region, we will have an overshoot. Now, what does that overshoot mean? We don't know exactly how long and how far and how deep it will be, but what are the potential impacts? The obvious one is temperature rises, and we can see how that's playing. I'll wrap this up in a few seconds just now. The big question for us, and Hans dealt with this here, is when you look at the difference between 1.5 and 2, and Aditi just showed us that 2 is, this is 2 at the mean, but actually your averages here are very high. The numbers are actually quite stunning. In the agricultural system, we're talking about a shift of between, let's say, between 40 million and 400 million people being at risk. And you know what mountain agriculture is like. It's very complex and it's difficult, as it is. But on top of that, you add these other questions and it becomes quite critical. Similarly, in questions of water. So these are huge nonlinear changes. This is exactly the reason why we say every day and every 0.1 of a degree makes a difference, because it impacts many, 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 many people across the world. So basically, this overshoot could push a large number of natural humans and human systems beyond their limits to adaptation. So that's one of the big debates that we're having just now. How do you define the questions of limits to adaptation? What are the residual risks and how can we deal with this? This is what has been going on for the last 3 days in this room here. And of course, the challenge for you, and I'm laying this out because this is something that Nepal will not participate probably in. If we overshoot, one of the only ways to deal with this is to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Fine? Of course, you can help with afforestation, reforestation for a whole range of things. But in other parts of the world, this is something that's going to create a huge amount of conflict. In the country that I come from, it will directly conflict with food, water, security, and a whole range of other questions. I mean, for us, it means massive social conflict because, we're a country of 1.4 billion people, we're about it across China. So basically, these CDR options have serious trade-offs. They may not have a direct impact as far as you're concerned, but what it does mean is, if they are not successful, if you cannot deploy them in time, we will have to adapt, or you will certainly have to adapt an awful lot more than you are actually expecting to. So I guess the question is, we can make a transition to 1.5 world, but this requires a completely different way of dealing with it. And the simple way that I try and explain this is, this cannot be done by the countries alone. This is an agreement among countries. We're an intergovernmental process here. It requires a minimum partnership of 200 countries, about 193 of them, and at least 5,000 places. And we have to do that in, guess how many days? In less than 4,000 days. That's all left. That's all that's left between now and 2030. Which means that we have to get province by province, district by district, the mobilization to make this happen. And that is why your being here is absolutely crucial and critical. Because it is climate action and development together and taking these difficult choices. What do you do first? Do I start looking at climate action or do I start looking at education? Because your resources are limited. You're a low-income country just at $1,000 per capita threshold. So how do you deal with this is a very, very challenging question. And we are trying to wrestle with these questions in the literature, in the science, and trying to see whether we can converge these through in what the chapter that I'm working on just now calls climate resilient development pathways. We actually don't know what it is. We're asking people across the world, what does it mean in your context? And if we get literature and research, we can actually try and flesh this out so that we can take it to the negotiators in the countries and say, look, people here are doing this stuff. They're making this happen, but we have to make this happen in a much more organized way in thousands or tens of thousands of places in the world, because we literally have a generation to make this happen. If we don't, the consequences are clear and obvious. The science is very clear. We have no ambiguity as far as that is concerned. So it's up to us as individuals, as people in particular institutions, and as societies to make this change in our everyday lives and in the structures and processes that we're part of. So thank you very much.